David O'Hearn's corner shop remained closed after its normal early opening hours. The reason for his absence would not only shock the hardiest of police, but would send tremors throughout the entire community.
The person we're looking for hasn't come under police notice before, which is a bit scary when you think about it.
We were looking for someone out there that was extremely dangerous.
I think any case where there's post-mortem mutilation should raise alarm bells for the police.
Those sort of things don't happen to ordinary people.
He had satanic leanings, and of all things, he was a filleter.
The next step was to try to identify who those prints belonged to.
Our hope is we're going to find another link to the chain within the possession of the killer.
I said, oh, well, you know, things aren't ever that grim. Depends on what you've done, I suppose.
To have two very brutal murders within 2 weeks of each other, you've got to start thinking what's happening down here.
The truth is not sitting there underneath the spotlight, but it's out in the shadows.
When relatives arrived at David O'Hearn's home, they made a gruesome discovery. The 60-year-old had been murdered. Police were about to embark on an investigation that would take many turns, and one most unexpected twist.
It was a scene that I'd never encountered in all my years in the police. There was a body of a male laying on his back. He'd been decapitated. There was a hand sitting on a lounge, and it appeared that he'd been completely disemboweled, and the intestines and that were laying on a silver tray that was alongside the body.
On one of the walls there was a pentagram with the word Satan beside it. Another wall had an inverted cross. And on a mirror above a side table, the word Satan had been written also.
All these drawings appeared to have been drawn in the victim's blood.
There were a large number of items on the floor around the body. There were 4 knives, a small metal saw, a razor blade, as well as a corkscrew. These items all had blood on them, so it was obvious they'd been used during the mutilation of the victim. But as to in what order that had taken place, we weren't able to tell at that time.
It was clear to me at the crime scene of David O'Hearn that the mutilation injuries happened after death, because there was really very little blood associated with those injuries.
Also located near to where the body was found resting was a crystal decanter which had a significant amount of blood staining.
There was a large amount of blood splatter in the room, but there was some directional blood splatter which was emanating from the head area of the victim. This blood splatter was extremely low level. It was coming from a source just above ground level, which indicated that a lot of the injuries to the victim's head had been occasioned whilst the victim was actually lying on the ground.
We moved further into the unit and we found the decapitated head that was sitting in the sink.
And there were some black gloves found beside the sink. They were moist and they were turned inside out, which suggested to me that the gloves were taken off at the completion of the whole incident.
The fingerless exercise gloves meant that there could be fingerprints within the flat, or hopefully on what looked to be the murder weapon.
There was evidence that somebody had ransacked his drawers looking for what appeared to be searching for an item of property. There was personal effects strewn out all over the top of David's bed.
We looked at robbery as a motive, but it just seemed too severe for a robbery, and the injuries in that Mr. O'Hearn suffered was far beyond, say, someone torturing someone to divulge the location of valuables. I think my initial thought was that this crime had been carried out by someone with a great deal of anger. There just seemed to be no pattern or rhyme or reason to it. For someone to kill someone and then go to this extent of the decapitation and the disemboweling.
To locals around Dapto, Dave O'Hearn was the friendly face behind the counter of the corner store. That's why they can't understand how anyone could kill him, especially in such a horrible way.
I just can't imagine him being involved in anything that would warrant what he went through.
In an investigation like this, one team will always be assigned to background the victim. It's important for us to find out who his associates are and who he's had dealings with, where he goes, where he comes from, everything about him.
David was a quiet person. He kept to himself a lot, but as a brother, he was very, very, very thoughtful, decent. He wasn't perfect, but he was a really good bloke. David had the corner shop for, I think, 2 years. Okay. He was always good for a loan, and I think he liked to help people that he thought needed a hand. We didn't know of anybody that could hate him that much. He just wasn't a person you could hate.
When David O'Hearn's body was found, the state of his clothing gave police a potential clue to the murder.
The fact that Mr O'Hearn's trousers and everything were down around his ankles suggested it may have been homosexual hate crime, but whilst there may have been some indication of homosexuality with him, all his relationships, I think we found over the period of time, in his 60 years, there may have been 3 relationships.
My family deny that he might have been a homosexual, but I'm sure he was. But in a very quiet, minded his own business sort of a way. He wasn't out there with it. He was very, very quiet.
The fact that David didn't have any enemies suggested to us that the person that had committed the offence was a stranger to David. And that being the case, it was going to be that much more difficult to identify who the killer was.
But their first clue as to who that stranger might be would come from the bizarre satanic drawings written in David's own blood on his lounge room walls. 63-year-old David O'Hearn was dead. Police, neighbours and his relatives had no clues as to why the popular shopkeeper had been so brutally murdered. Detectives hoped that his last known movements would give them a clue.
He was a creature of habit. He would open his shop at certain times and close it at certain times. So we were able to identify roughly a closing time of the shop.
His normal closing time was around 5 o'clock. In his car we found some groceries, and in the bags was a docket from one of the supermarkets at Dapto that indicated that he'd been through the checkout around about 5:30.
On top of that, we did examine CCTV footage that was maintained by the shopping centre, and we were able to confirm that it was David that actually paid for the goods.
And just as he was leaving the shop, he ran into one of Mum's nurses and she said, "Oh, hello, David. When you're coming to see Mum?" He said, "Oh, I'll be there tomorrow. Give her my love and say I'll be there at lunchtime with the sandwich." And she was the last person that David spoke to, as far as we know.
And they were able to give us some indication about his state of mind, which said that he was happy and quite okay. Didn't appear to be under threat from any person or being followed by anyone.
The fact that his vehicle was located in the garage and still had bags of perishable and non-perishable items suggested to police that the meeting with the offender occurred shortly after parking the car in the garage.
The fact that there was no sign of entry or forced entry on his house would indicate that he either knew the person and let them in, or his door was unlocked and the person had just walked in unannounced.
The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was due to severe blunt force head injury caused by some blunt object. The head injuries were all at the back of the head, so clearly Mr O'Hearn was not facing his attacker at the time these blows were rained down upon him. So to that extent I think it was quite a surprise attack.
Mr. Ahern had a fractured skull and there was hair and blood on the decanter that was consistent with the wound that he'd suffered. So therefore the decanter turned out to be the murder weapon.
The bloody decanter and its stopper were now being examined in the fingerprint laboratory.
The wine decanter was placed in a superglue chamber to be tested for any possible fingerprints. The superglue vaporises and falls onto the surface, highlighting any fingerprints that appear on the surface in a white visible matter.
The fingerprints on that particular item suggested to the investigation team that the offender actually had touched the lid of that decanter. So the next step was to try to identify who those prints belonged to.
But when the one identifiable fingerprint on the stopper was put into the police database, there was no match.
To an investigation team, that meant that the offender hadn't been charged or certainly didn't have his fingerprints on file.
The tools that had been used to decapitate David after his death were also subjected to fingerprint examination. But while no fingerprints were identified, the tools were giving the detectives a small lead.
We looked in the garage and in the cupboards in the kitchen area, and we subsequently found similar tools in the cupboard directly above the fridge area. Obviously, to me, it was difficult to maintain eyesight of it and actually had to stand on my tippy toes and occasionally hop up to see these tools, where it was quite simple for my offsider to eyeball these tools. So to me, that suggested that the offender was floating around the height of about 6 foot tall. We were able to show that there were similar knives in David's kitchen. We found some tools which are consistent with the tools that we found on the carpet. It suggests to me that the offender went there unarmed.
The satanic drawings scrawled in blood on the walls of the crime scene had also provided police with another crucial lead, an indication of the killer's identity.
A man found murdered in his home on the south coast may have been the victim of a satanic cult. The macabre case just south of Wollongong has detectives baffled.
One of the main lines of inquiries was to identify people that lived in the area that had an interest in satanic activity.
We had received some information relating to a fellow called Schreiber and his leaning towards the occult and satanic areas. We also found in our inquiry that Schreiber lived only a couple of doors down from Ahern, so he became a very, very strong person of interest.
Police believe the killing was some sort of a ritual, the work of devil worshippers.
Detective Sergeant Raymond, this is Detective Sergeant Wilkins.
It was important to speak to Keith Schreiber. Police went to the address up the road from David Ahern. Subsequently spoke to Keith's flatmate. Keith wasn't at home, but they were invited to inspect Keith's room, and it was at that time that they identified a number of hand sketches, which was consistent with the crime scene.
In his bedroom they found a number of drawings that depicted headless bodies and disembowelment, and it was as a result of that that Schreiber became a very, very strong suspect.
The instant thought that came to my mind was that Keith, if not directly involved in the murder, had some connection to it. There were just too many close similarities between the drawings that we identified and that which was identified in the crime scene. It was important that we locate Keith and committing to a version which would account for his movements on the night.
You Keith Schreiber? Yeah?
Schreiber was located at his place of employment, which was a fish market, and of all things he was a filleter.
Where were you last Friday? Working?
We obtained his version of events. He gave us the alibi that he was staying with his employer for the evening and actually had been sleeping on the floor as they had to make an early start to go to the Sydney fish markets. Police subsequently spoke to his employer, who confirmed the fact that Keith had spent the night on his lounge room floor.
The detectives' only lead had vanished, and they were back to square one. Worse still, another murder had just occurred. and the similarities to the O'Hearn crime scene could not be ignored. David O'Hearn was found murdered in his flat. He had been mutilated and dismembered. Now, only 2 weeks later, and only a kilometre away, another murder was occupying the team of detectives. A murder that had eerie similarities to the first.
Former MP and alleged pedophile Frank Arkell murdered in his Wollongong home. His killer is being hunted by the same team of detectives investigating the decapitation murder of another man at nearby Albion Park Rail 2 weeks ago.
If you can picture the crime scene, as you're looking in the front doors of the granny flat, the glass doors had opened up, and then immediately confronting you straight at the door was a double bed. And over beyond the double bed lay Frank's body.
He wasn't easily identifiable at that stage due to the amount of blood that covered his face. It was obvious that he'd suffered substantial injury to his head.
You could see that there was a broken lampshade lying next to the body that had been used in the attack, and it was the ferocity of the attack had broken it.
I think Mr Arkell died as a result predominantly of head injury, but there was also a suggestion based on the presence of a cord around the neck and some marks on the neck that he may also have been strangled. Those injuries, and collectively they were over 40, would have taken some time to inflict.
Like the murder of David O'Hearn, the offender had used whatever was on hand to kill his victim.
The pattern of injuries was quite similar with both men. The bed lamp that I think was used on Frank Arkell and the wine decanter on Mr O'Hearn, they were both weapons of opportunity in that they were already at the scene.
Likewise, the mutilation to the body had occurred post-death.
When I examined the face of Frank Arkell, I noted it was an unusual and very sadistic characteristic that 3 tie pins had been inserted into his face. One had been sunk deeply into his cheek, whilst another 2 were inserted, one in each eye.
Quite similar post-mortem mutilation and effects done to the body made me think that possibly there was one perpetrator involved in both of those murders.
As police searched the flat for any trace the killer had left behind, they found a plastic lunchbox full of tie pins.
Given that the victim had been assaulted with a number of tie pins, it was quite feasible that the offender may well have handled this item.
The lunchbox, along with the glass sliding door, the only entry to the flat, were removed and sent for fingerprint analysis. Both yielded results. Yet neither print matched any known offender in the police database, nor did they match the fingerprint at the O'Hearn crime scene.
The fact that they don't match does not suggest they didn't come from the same hand or from the same offender. It just suggests that they came from a different part of the hand.
To us, we looked at the cases as being linked, and our obvious starting point of evidence is to try and identify these fingerprints. And of course, we come up blank, primarily because the fingerprints weren't on record, which is a bit scary when you think about it. A person who had no criminal record all of a sudden leaping into murder.
The only motive police had to work with for the murder of Frank Arkell was revenge. This was a crime scene that suggested great hatred, and Frank Arkell had recently been accused of paedophilia.
There's one thing I'm totally opposed, is young people being interfered with by older people.
13 months ago, the former Lord Mayor was arrested and charged with 29 sex offences involving boys and men. He was due to stand trial in September on 4 of the charges.
Police are keeping a close eye on suspected pederasts living in the area, just in case. Detectives are questioning some of Frank Arkell's victims as part of their investigation.
Lots of people were interviewed and lots of statements were taken from people who had made allegations that Frank had sexually assaulted them. But they were all spoken to at length and their alibis were very good. We were satisfied that they, as individuals, had not caused Frank's death.
There was a possibility that their killer was someone that didn't know Frank, and it was more of just a thrill killer. And then, of course, you couple with what's happened with David O'Hearn. Are they linked? What is the commonalities between the two? Frank and David O'Hearn known to each other?
The only link was that each was homosexual. But that didn't stop the media carelessly linking the two in other ways.
Police have set up a new task force to investigate Mr Arkell's murder. It will work closely with another team looking into the violent death of David O'Hearn. It's thought both men were involved in a child sex network. Frank Arkell was facing multiple sex charges, accused of drugging young men, then forcing them to have sex with him. It's believed he was well acquainted with 60-year-old David O'Hearn, who was found murdered in his Wollongong townhouse 2 weeks ago.
They didn't appear to have facts. It seemed to be that they were just making it up, and that hurts the family the most. The way that the media portrayed David as this sick person, this person that would be involved with a sick crime, like with paedophilia, any of that. That just never, ever entered our heads because he just wasn't that sort of person.
Let me say that when we looked into David's background, we certainly dug that deep into his background that we knew just about everything about that man. That was an area that could be sort of ruled out.
The fact remained, 2 men were dead within 2 weeks of each other. The fear was whether the killer would strike again or whether he had killed before and it had gone unnoticed.
We started to look at a lot of homosexual murders. We started to delve into ones that are unsolved as well, because you've got David and Frank. We certainly looked at maybe there's a homosexual angle there somewhere.
The brutal murders of 2 Wollongong men, David O'Hearn and Frank Arkell, had police concerned there was a serial killer on the loose. The question was, had the offender possibly killed before?
Where do you start looking for somebody that's got common links? Do you look beyond the Wollongong area, which we did? We started to look at a lot of homosexual murders. We started to delve into ones that are unsolved as well, because you've got David and Frank. We certainly looked at maybe there's a homosexual angle there somewhere.
It's believed the killer who used a lamp to bash Mr Arkell could also be responsible for 2 other murders, shopkeeper David O'Hearn at nearby Albion Park Rail and convicted pederast Trevor Parkin at Glebe.
Trevor Parkin had been subjected to a very brutal killing. He'd been beaten about the head and mutilated.
The similarities to the David O'Hearn crime scene were obvious.
It appeared at both crime scenes that they died as a result of blunt force trauma to the head, and there was mutilation to the genitals of both victims.
But Trevor Parkin's murder had occurred 6 months before and was 80 kilometres away from those in Wollongong.
So, as an investigator, you're looking at a wide area and you just wonder, where does the killer live? Because, the assumption is that the killer must live within a close proximity to where the offence occurred. But here we go, we've got an hour and a half between 2 crime scenes, and it could be anywhere.
But the geographical difference was soon overlooked. What police believed they had found on this railway station not only linked the cities, but the crimes.
Some of Trevor Parkin's property that was stolen from his flat at the time was found on a train at Waterfall railway station. And Waterfall is a suburb that's on that rail line between Sydney and Wollongong. It's only a couple of stops away from Wollongong itself. So to have property found that was stolen from Trevor Parkin's flat, found directly on the southern line where these other 2 murders occurred, is significant. The assumption we had to make was that the killer must live on the south coast, live down in the Wollongong area.
The 3 investigations were kept separate at that stage because we didn't know whether we were dealing with 1 person, whether we were dealing with 3 persons.
A significant find to us from Trevor Parkin's flat at Glebe was a whole handprint on the wall in blood, which is very unusual to find, and it's something that we certainly valued tremendously.
But that handprint could not be matched to any on file, nor its fingerprint to those at the O'Hearn or Arkell crime scenes.
We've got at least a hand in one of the scenes. Surely that fingerprint must match to the others. But when it's looked at, you must have the same digit on each of the scenes. So the handprint that was found in blood didn't match up with the prints that we found on the decanter and or the door of Frank Arkell.
You've got to realise that you've got 8 fingers and 2 thumbs, and unless the full set of prints are available, never in a million years are you ever going to match as two together unless you have the two full sets of prints to compare.
But while the police had no fingerprints to help them discover who the offender was, they had found solid evidence at Arkell's residence that they were now chasing up.
We had found a pair of Nike tracksuit pants that were found turned inside out, so in a position as though they had been taken off and taken off in a hurry and left on the floor, and a pair of Colorado boots, those type that were very popular at that time.
The tracksuit pants were a Nike brand with a very thick stripe, and they were very much against what Frank would wear. The Colorado boots were size 9.5 and he wore a size 7, so it was obvious to us that the clothes had been discarded by the killer.
Detectives knew the killer had used weapons found at the crime scene to kill his victim, and chances were he'd also taken some of Arkell's clothing.
Up inside the main house, I remember seeing a maroon-coloured tracksuit top and a maroon-coloured bottom, and I think I saw a black top as well, and then we just couldn't find the black pants to it. So then you start to look around the house to see if you've got matching items of clothing. Does a tracksuit top fit with a tracksuit bottom? And we're able to look up into the main house itself and look through the clothing with the help of the housekeeper. We had the top, but we were missing a pair of tracksuit pants. So to us, the killer's left his clothes behind that were blood-stained and then left in a pair of Frank's tracksuit pants. If we get to an arrest stage, our hope is we're going to find another item from Frank's house, another link to the chain within the possession of the killer.
But they needed to find the killer first, and the boots were providing a good lead.
We really seized upon the opportunity that the offender had given us to have in our own possession his actual shoes. So that was a very exciting thing for a strike force to have.
We followed the trail of Colorado boots back to the manufacturers. We were able to look at the batch numbers, the brand numbers, where they were distributed. There wasn't anything we didn't know about Colorado boots.
We identified one particular shop in the area of Wollongong. So we went to the shop, we asked for all their sales records of Colorado boots, and we ended up with, I think it was 6 credit card slips.
The task then for police was to track down those 6 customers, one of which could potentially be their killer.
Majority of the time, the people still had the boots. On some occasions, they're actually wearing them when police spoke with them. We were quickly able to eliminate those 6 people from the inquiry with those Colorado boots. So it got to a point where the inquiries with the people didn't advance us any further.
It was more than likely the boots had been a cash purchase, and with no better luck with the track pants, the police hoped the public might give them a lead.
Police say clothing dumped near the mutilated body of alleged sex offender Frank Arkell has given them vital clues to his killer.
These are the clothes worn by Frank Arkell's killer. A pair of blood-spattered tracksuit pants, socks and hiking boots found discarded in the granny flat where Mr Arkell was murdered.
We're obviously anxious to speak to anyone that's recognised these items of clothing or in fact seen anybody wearing those clothes in the area.
But while no leads came from the clothes that night,
I saw a red car leaving
a call
the driveway.
did come into Crime Stoppers about a car leaving Frank Arkell's house on the night he was murdered.
The possibility was that this could have been the killer leaving the house, and it's something we had to explore. We couldn't leave it undone.
Police were desperate to find the person who had likely killed 2 men in 2 weeks and another 6 months before, but they were getting nowhere.
It's easy on the TV, they do it overnight, but in real life it doesn't happen that way. It takes a lot of work to try and get these things done to get results. It just doesn't happen overnight.
Hello, Crime Stoppers?
But detectives were hoping a call that had just come in would speed up the process.
We followed that call up, which led us to speak to the man. It said he saw a red Nissan Skyline car leave the vicinity of either Frank Arkell's or the neighbour's house. He was driving home, past the area. He thought that he saw a car come out of a driveway, whether it was Frank's driveway or the next door neighbour's driveway. At 3 o'clock in the morning, it fits within our estimated time of death. This could have been the killer leaving the house, and it's something we had to explore.
This is the car police, detectives and investigators from Task Force Lincoln have been searching for. The vehicle, smashed and stripped, was uncovered by police in bushland at Mount Ousley on Sunday. A similar vehicle was seen in the vicinity of Mr Arkell's Reserve Street home at 2:30 a.m. the next day.
But police needed to confirm whether this really was the car that their witness had seen. And after tracking him down, they interviewed him in an unconventional way. Hypnosis.
I want you to close your eyes over and go into a deep sound hypnotic sleep. Just relax.
Hypnotism, like everything else, is not an exact science, and the challenge is as to what he's going to recall that he hasn't told you before.
There was high hopes that the witness would remember the registration number. Even a part of it would help.
Was there one or two persons in the car? Which direction the car went? Are you able to narrow down any identifying marks on the car?
He was a male in his 20s.
The hypnosis was able to confirm, yes, it was a red Nissan Skyline that he saw, and I think he was able to establish that it was within the driveway of Frank Arkell. Beyond that, there was one person driving, a male by themselves in the car, and he was able to provide a description, and based on that description, a sketch artist helped prepare a composite picture of the type of person that we're looking for.
The computer-enhanced image compiled after hypnosis was used on a witness who spotted a red sedan near Mr Arkell's home the night of his murder.
Well, our witness believes that that's about 75% likeness of the person that he saw.
During the examination of the red Nissan Skyline, a number of items were examined and subjected to laboratory analysis and examination. Unfortunately, they didn't provide any link between this vehicle and the crime.
So the strike force has to pick themselves up again and look at what they've got left and follow those other leads.
The strongest lead was the killer's clothes found at Frank Arkell's flat. Now, 3 months after their discovery, they were paying dividends.
One of the calls was from an ex-girlfriend of a person that she said used to regularly wear a similar Nike tracksuit and similar Colorado boots, but no longer in fact wore them. The girlfriend had also told us that when she had spoken to her boyfriend about him not wearing the clothing anymore, that he became agitated. He didn't want to tell her any detail about that.
As well as being very sheepish about the location of the boots and the tracksuit pants, she'd noticed that the boyfriend had developed an interest in the murders itself and started to keep paper clippings and started to talk about it. So here we are, we've got a person that owns not just the boots, not just the tracksuit pants, owns both. And they vanished, for want of a better word, shortly after the death of Frank Arkell. So you're starting to look at something that's a very promising lead.
The woman had given us the name of her ex-boyfriend as being Mark Van Crevel.
Mark was currently unemployed, but had commuted to Sydney for work in the past.
We decided to watch his movements, and we watched them very closely and constantly from that period of time. If he was our murderer, we had to protect the community from him striking out again, but we didn't have enough to arrest him.
During the surveillance operation, our suspect was seen in the company of some of his friends, including Keith Schreiber.
Keith Schreiber was the initial suspect in the David O'Hearn murder investigation.
Coincidentally and very relevant is the fact that Keith Schreiber lived in the same street as David O'Hearn, and that Mark Van Crevel lived for good periods of time with Keith Schreiber in that house.
Police now realised when they went in search of Schreiber, the door to his flat was opened by Mark Van Crevel. As luck would have it, Van Crevel was taken to the police station at that time.
He just flew right under the radar. He was simply just an alibi witness. So as a result, a typed interview was taken from Mark Van Crevel, accounting for Keith's movements.
I told you that I intended asking you further questions about it.
As is the case with all people that are interviewed in any homicide investigation, a hard copy of the interview is made. Both the person taking part in the interview and police sign it, and the document's filed in a plastic sleeve and used for future reference in the investigation.
An idea was put forward that we should, in fact, fingerprint the statement that he had provided as an alibi witness to Keith Schreiber.
In order to obtain fingerprints from a piece of paper, the exhibit is placed in a liquid chemical, which is called ninhydrin. This chemical reacts with the amino acids of the fingerprint that is on the paper. The fingerprint develops and becomes visible by a purple stain.
That purple stain revealed a clear set of fingerprints, and they matched the O'Hearn and Arkell murder scenes.
Finally, we've got this exciting bit of evidence that we've identified fingerprints on that document link him to both crimes.
And while there was little doubt those fingerprints were those of Mark Van Crevel's, police were not prepared to arrest him until they were absolutely sure they were his.
Effectively, you're arresting someone, you're taking away their liberty, and effectively you could put them away for jail for the rest of their life. So it is a serious game that we play, and you've got to be precise in what you do, you've got to be backed up by evidence, you've really got to be very thorough in what you do and methodical.
And so the detectives waited for the opportunity to seize the evidence they needed.
He happened to be drinking from a Coke bottle and discarded it. Our police were very quick on the spot and very resolute to think about it. They used an initiative, grabbed the Coke bottle, and we developed some fingerprints from that Coke bottle.
Within minutes, Mark Van Crevel's fingerprints were ready for comparison.
So the fingerprints found on the Coke bottle were the same that were found on the record of interview, were the same that were found at the crime scenes. They were those of Mark Van Crevel.
Police now made plans to arrest Mark Van Crevel. But those plans could well be thwarted.
He came in and said, "Oh, I want to tell you something, but if I tell you, will it mean I'll be expelled or removed from training?" I said, "Oh, well, Mark, you know, things aren't ever that grim. Depends on what you've done, I suppose."
After 4 months of investigation, police were preparing to arrest Mark Van Crevel. But the 19-year-old, who regularly practiced Taekwondo, had his own plans.
Mark was just one of those students in amongst the whole group. Just a young teenager, I think, when he started. And, yeah, just trained like everybody else. He was keen. You know, he'd sweep the floor, he'd bow when he was supposed to bow, and train hard when he was supposed to train hard. He did all the right things. He was a good young boy, there's no doubt about it. On this day, it was business as usual. I was in the office just doing a little bit of paperwork before class started, and Mark came in and was sort of a bit agitated. And I asked him, was there anything wrong? And he kind of just shook his head and said, "Oh, I want to tell you something, but if I tell you, will it mean I'll be expelled or removed from training?" I said, "Oh, well, Mark, you know, things aren't ever that grim. Depends on what you've done, I suppose." I'm pretty sure he said, "You know those murders in the paper? Yeah, well, I did them." You know. So that sort of sent me in a bit of a head spin. I thought, oh, well, maybe he's not telling me the truth, or he's just seeking attention. I was a bit angry, actually. I rang another instructor to come in and take the class. So I thought, oh, best to be safe than sorry. So I just told him to go and get changed. My first priority was to get Mark out of that environment. I mean, if someone says something like that, then there's every possibility it could be true. I was kind of, in my heart, I was hoping it wasn't, you know.
We're going to go for a drive, OK?
I told him we'd go for a drive. So we were going down the expressway because he didn't want to go to the police. That's something he told me straight away. I don't want to go to the police. He said a lot of stuff, but when he was talking, I know this sounds odd, but I wasn't listening because my mind was going over all the scenarios as quickly as I could about how to get him to the police station. The coffee shop we went to was the closest place I could think of to the police station. So we're having coffee, and I mean, it was a bit of a heated discussion too at times. I mean, I was trying to keep it calm, but I didn't want to fire him up either. But I knew from the martial arts side of training, if I demanded something, then there's a good chance I'd probably get it. So in the end, it was kind of a demand. We're going here, you're doing as you're told. And that was it. And I think that took him a bit by surprise. I was getting quite relieved by then. But then he wanted to visit his unit where he was living. He wanted me to mind a knife and a sword and that. And of course, that then got my mind racing again. I thought, hang on a minute, maybe he's changed his mind. So he went inside and I opened the boot of my car and I stood back probably 200 metres down the road. When he came out, he said, "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you." And I said, "Well, it might not be that way, Mark, but just put him in the car and close the boot." And I said, "I'll be much happier." Then we got into the car and I thought, oh, OK, we're going to go to the police station now, which is really good. So we finally got to the police station and I was starting to get really relieved. We spoke to the young lady at the desk and she asked what we wanted. I said I needed to speak to someone in charge. And she said, what was it concerning? And I said, oh, well, the young man with me, his name's Mark, and he's admitted to 2 murders.
Mark Van Crevel had walked into the Wollongong police station voluntarily. His chilling confession would take all night and last until the early hours of the next morning.
I suppose in your own words, can you tell me what information you have about the death of Mr. O'Hearn?
I don't know anything much about David himself, but I murdered him. I had in my mind that I wanted to kill someone that day. I went to David O'Hearn's house at about 6 o'clock at night. And I walked into his house.
I'll just get Detective Casser just to stand there, and if you can take the place of David O'Hearn for the purposes of this exercise, if I can just get you to stand up, please. And if you can indicate, if Detective Casser is walking away that way, if you can just indicate what you did with him.
Yep. I walk, and bang, hit him on the head, and he slumped down there.
Join me next week for that incredible encounter as we go inside the mind of a killer.